So, the American Psychiatric Association reported that unresolved depression accounts for a 35% reduction in productivity, costing the economy $210.5 billion annually. Again, this is specifically for the United States, but this is the reality of the impact that unresolved mental illnesses have on our society. And this prompted me to create the proposed solution of government intervention through spending. But the only way for this to be an actual solution is that there is indeed a relationship between increased intervention and increased productivity. So the thesis essentially states that by running a multiple linear regression, which is the relationship between a dependent variable, GDP per capita, and multiple independent variables, we are able to establish that there is a relationship between the main independent variable, federal mental health expenditures, which is treatments, medications, and counseling, and that will all fall under the proxy of government intervention, and an increase in GDP per capita, which is the productivity proxy measurement. So with the intent of the project established, I was able to gather data for mental health expenditures as a ratio of health expenditures from the World Health Organization and GDP per capita data from the World Bank. This data was collected in 2011 and spanned across 77 distinct countries. I was able to use R to perform the multiple linear regression model, and so subsequent graphs and tables were all developed there. To account for omitted variable bias, which is the potential variables that can impact the statistical model, I used 3 government indicators, and that is to increase the precision of the results. And again, this is a correlational analysis between intervention and productivity. So the preliminary analysis allowed me to better visualize the data I was working with, and specifically to highlight that the median GDP per capita in 2011 was around 6,590, and the mean mental health expenditures percentage was just 3.44%. As these are mainly summary statistics, there are so many other external factors that can impact these descriptions, so digging deeper was important in my case. These bottom 2 graphs are the frequencies of my main variables, which is mental health expenditures and GDP per capita. And obviously they don't follow a normal distribution, and the implications of that will be discussed more later on. The 3 specific omitted variables included were regulatory quality, government effectiveness, and voice and accountability. There are 3 different measures that essentially measure the public satisfaction with their government, and again is to increase the accuracy and control for external variables. The most important relationship that I wanted to establish throughout the preliminary analysis was between ratio of mental health expenditures and GDP per capita. So graphing them on the scatter plot, we can see that there is a stronger positive correlation between the 2, and this was further emphasized by the Pearson's correlation coefficient of 0.74. Both graphs do show the pattern of a heavy cluster around low expenditures and low GDP per capita, which was to be expected. Based on these correlation statements, I was able to establish that there is a substantial relationship between intervention and productivity, and was able to move on to regression testing with more confidence. It was important to me that I ran both a simple linear regression and a multiple linear regression, just to make sure that there was a difference in the variables that were involved. In the simple linear regression, it's combining the dependent variable of GDP per capita with mental health expenditures ratio. And I found that for every 1% increase in the expenditures ratio, we can expect a $4,320.7 increase in GDP per capita. Along with this, I ran a 95% confidence interval, which is stating that for a lot of samples of the same size, 95% of the time, we can expect that the change in GDP per capita will fall between the identified interval. And the results of this was significant because their p-value was less than 0.1. Like most statistical analysis, there's always a step further that we can take, And in my case, this was running a multiple linear regression model, which includes the 3 independent variables along with the original mental health expenditures, all relating back to the GDP per capita. And here I found that for every 1% increase in mental health expenditures ratio, we can expect a $1,639.2 increase in GDP per capita. I ran a similar 95% confidence interval to prove that the change in GDP per capita should fall between these 2 numbers. Again, the specific regression model here, the multiple linear regression model, the purpose was to increase the accuracy of the conclusion of the change in GDP per capita with the inclusion of the 3 omitted variables and to control for any externalities that there might be. So essentially here, I stated that there is a strong positive correlation between government mental health expenditures and GDP per capita. However, taking them out of their proxied forms, we can establish a conclusion that an increase in government intervention correlates to a substantial increase in individual productivity and thus labor output. The more labor output we have, the more the vitality of a global economy grows. And on an individual scale, this broadens the standards of living. Despite there being a relationship established, there were limitations to my results. And as we discussed in the preliminary analysis, the proxy datasets did not follow a normal distribution, causing concern for statistical analysis. To combat this, we can either run a logarithmic transformation of all the data or simply use non-parametric testing. Since the data was from 77 self-reporting countries, it eliminated my ability to standardize results across countries, but it didn't detract from the correlations we found individually. And again, this data was only from 2011, so patterns across time couldn't be identified. Instead of having the limitations restrict my research, I wanted to really prioritizing transforming them into areas of growth for the project, which is why I'm currently working on geographical analysis and data transformation. So that's taking the entire data set, transforming it to force it into a normal distribution, separating it by region, Europe, Africa, Asia, etc., and running separate multiple linear regression models to see the differences in government intervention there. The final 2 steps we could take is either a time series analysis or resource allocation. The former being focusing on one specific country and seeing its relationship across time and how different events might impact that. And finally, resource allocation is taking various programs that have been established, analyzing them for the most effective one, and presenting a solution that combines the established relationship between growth in intervention and growth in productivity, along with the most effective program, which allows the government to make a better and more sustainable decision for resource allocation long-term. So at the end of the day, we really need to take what has been found and find the connection to what is to be found. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for this presentation, and I commend you for staying so poised despite the technical challenges and doing such a smooth and fantastic presentation. So truly, truly well done. Excellent work. So there are many questions from the audience, and we have just a minute or 2 to go through them. Let me start with the most recent one. Which time periods do you think would be the most illuminating to investigate in addition? Something like the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps?
Yes, so obviously 2011 was before everything happened. And especially after COVID-19, obviously we've seen mental health illnesses and various issues like that spike. And so that might have a huge impact on how different governments and different programs are used. So I think the span from 2018 to 2022, just to have a couple years before and a couple years after to see the differences there would be really interesting.
Great. Did you run into any unexpected challenges in coding? It seems like you had a difficult project and really interesting one. If so, how did you handle them?
Yeah, so me and my mentor, we discussed how we should deal with the normality issue, which is that the data didn't follow a normal distribution. And we focused just simply on using the data as it was. And right now we're working on actually transforming the data just to increase the accuracy. And the coding itself is just, as long as you have the right data and the right coding line, it wasn't too difficult. So yeah.
Great. And there is a third audience question, which is asking if you could explain to an uninformed audience member what omitted variable bias is and how you helped avoid it.
Yes, so I did touch on that a little bit, but omitted variable bias it's just a group of variables that can impact the statistical output if you don't have them in there. So the actual conclusion might be less accurate than what it could be. So in my case, there's not a specific list of indicators that could impact how GDP per capita changes, but I tried to think about what could impact a government's spending. And I thought that coming across government indicators, which is what the public perceives the government as, would be an interesting way to control for that type of bias.
Got it. Elizabeth, I'm sure there are many more audience questions, and I'll encourage the audience to directly message Elizabeth and pose the questions. She'll be seeing them and we'll be able to answer. And thank you very much for the great research and the thoughtful presentation and sharing this with us today.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.